السلام عليكم. مرحبا بكم في معرض أبو ظبي الدولي للكتاب، وشكرا على حضوركم هذه الجلسة. أنا مينا العريبي رئيسة تحرير صحيفة The National، ولي الشرف أن أدير هذه الجلسة مع الدكتور مايكل نايتس، وهو طبعاً باحث ومؤرخ معروف جداً في معهد واشنطن في العاصمة الأمريكية واشنطن at the Washington Institute، وهو مؤلف كتاب 25 يوما إلى عدن. والليلة إطلاق النسخة اللغة العربية لهذا الكتاب الذي أصدر باللغة الإنجليزية، وقرأته باللغتين الإنجليزية والعربية، وفيه الكثير من التفاصيل عن مهمة عسكرية في غاية الأهمية، ليس فقط لليمن ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، وإنما للعالم العربي وللعالم، لأهمية مدينة عدن، وطبعاً كل ما يتطلبه العالم من حماية اليمن والمنطقة المحيطة باليمن. فسنناقش الكتاب وأطرح بعض الأسئلة على الدكتور مايكل نايتس باللغة الإنجليزية، فاعذروني سأنتقل للغة الإنجليزية، ولكن لدينا ترجمة فورية لمن يريد بعد حديثنا الأول أن يطرح بعض الأسئلة على الدكتور مايكل نايتس إما باللغة العربية أو الإنجليزية. أهلا وسهلا، فشكرا لكم لحضوركم. And Michael, it's great to have you here. Thank you for being here. And what a great feat. I wanted to do a brief introduction. So Dr. Michael Knights, those of us who follow the Middle East, particularly Iraq, Iran, and the Gulf states, know Michael quite well. He's a fellow at the Washington Institute and specializes in military and security affairs of Iraq, Iran, and Gulf states. He's also co-founder of Militia Spotlight platform, which is incredibly detailed and is a wealth of knowledge for journalists, researchers, and others, and has written extensively. I won't go through your entire biography as we want to get to the book. So in March 2015, there was that very important Aden battle, and this is the 25 days that you chronicle in this major feat of a book. It's based on interviews and really embedding with soldiers, getting what us journalists like to say, the first source accounting. And you did that in great detail, but also to know how the UAE Arab coalition fought, and as you say, a ghost from the mountain next to the world's most important seaway. So I want to start by asking you, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? All right, good. Well, thanks very much, Mina. Thanks very much to the Abu Dhabi Book Fair and to ALC and to Dr. Ali and to everybody at ALC who made this such a pleasant visit, and also such a pleasant experience to write the book with ALC. Also thank you to Profile Books who edited and produced the English language edition of the book. Now, what made me write 25 Days to Aden was a love of a couple of things. One, Yemen and Aden. It's one of my favorite countries in the world to visit, and it's one of my favorite cities in the world, in Aden, which has a rich history going right the way back to prehistory, and then the history of maritime affairs in the Indian Ocean. Empires come and go, but Aden remains very important all the time. And the other thing was my love of the UAE and Yemeni militaries. And I have been following the UAE military since the late 1990s. And even back then, I could tell it was a different kind of Arab military. It was making very good choices about its training, its education, its partnerships, and procurement of key equipment. And I could see that they were going to become a great small military. And in the Yemen war in 2015, the two things that I wanted to write about came together. And in particular, the story of the Battle of Aden at the start of the war in 2015 is a tremendous story. It almost writes itself because it's so dramatic. It has these moments when the UAE could have either quit and left, or double their effort and continue. And every time they choose to double their effort and continue, and eventually they win the battle and they remove the Houthis from the city, which is a bit of a spoiler.
So, I mean, one of the things about the book is the detail that's in it. You've got stories and key characters that drive the story, but also maps, photos, tactical information that requires a lot of trust. And, you know, the war is not fully over yet, but, you know, and so in some ways this is quite contemporary. But how were you able to get that access, to get that trust and putting together the book now that you, as you explained, you had the motivation to do it, to actually get to it?
So I've spent a lot of my career embedded with military forces around the world in the Middle East, whether it's the Iraqi military, the Peshmerga, the Yemeni military before the Arab Spring, the US and UK military, you know, and other forces, including in Yemen more recently. Being there with them on the ground is a good way to build trust because you share the risks with them. And you also live with them, as you know, as a journalist. You live with them day in, day out. And, you know, in some ways it always reduces your impartiality a little bit. But honestly, I'm not ashamed to say that I was in support of the Gulf intervention in Yemen from the beginning. I thought it was the right thing to do. And so it wasn't a case of changing my mind really about the intervention. I'm also, you know, I became very close to the UAE armed forces and the commanders, the Yemeni armed forces and commanders, and that trust becomes a two-way street. Now, you know, I'm a military historian by training, so my number one priority is accuracy. Because history belongs to the future generations, and that means that you have to record that history accurately, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. And what I think the UAE military learned with me was that, you know, in the Battle of Aden, they had a very inspiring story to tell. And it's not the habit of the UAE military to talk about its operations. It's a very secretive military. But I think they recognized this story was really important to tell for the new generations of Emiratis, particularly those who will do national service one day. And they realized with me, I'd been writing about the UAE military for a long time, and I'd always had a pretty accurate, fair assessment of them. And so when they got to know me a bit better, embedding with them, they kind of realized, okay, this is worth the risk. Let's see how this works. And they gave me a lot of access to not only the people who fought the battles in Yemen, but also things like imagery from the battles taken by the participants themselves. Now, when you look at the book, you'll see we have blanked out the faces of the serving officers because they're still involved in sensitive work across the world. Many precautions were taken with security to ensure that the UAE did not lose any of its secrets that it needed to keep. But we were also able to tell a very complete story of the battle. And why that's important is because only with the details do you really understand how effective the UAE armed forces were in Aden and in general in Yemen. Only then, you know, do international people who read about this story understand, wow, the UAE is a very advanced military. It's learned an awful lot from the US, the UK, NATO partners in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Kosovo. But the UAE has also brought its own unique strengths to this military as well, in terms of its cultural understanding of the Middle East, in terms of the way it integrates the Emirates Red Crescent into all of its operations. So in some ways you get the best of the Western military, but you also get the best of a Middle Eastern culture who are doing a peacekeeping operation.
You touched upon my next question by speaking about the importance of writing and documenting military histories. So, you know, So I want to build up a bit on that. What do military history books tell us about current landscapes, but also making sure that they're there for the future? Why this particular genre is important?
So military history is not a genre of Arab writing that is very strong at the moment. In the past, I think writers of Arab military histories have either been the generals that undertook the battles, and sometimes they wanted to primarily show themselves as very capable, or they are accounts that do not want to recognize when things go wrong sometimes. So fair and critical military history is something that needs to be developed in the Middle East. Now, everyone here, I'm sure, would say it's important for a nation to understand its history, where it's come from, how much it has progressed, the things it achieved, and the difficulties along the way, the things that they learned from. And military history is doubly important because it's the moment when your nation is tested in the most extreme way. And the Yemen war is really the most extreme moment for the UAE so far as a military power. So, as a military historian, you're capturing a very important part of a country's history. And it's also a part of the history that can disappear quickly, because it's surprising how quick people forget the things that have happened to them. And it's also surprising the way not everything makes it into the official records. The person's experience of war, of battle, many small details that don't quite make it into the historic record. Those things need to be captured very quickly after they happen, or people forget. And so for accuracy, I think contemporary history is very important. Some people stay away from contemporary history, which is very fresh and new, because people say it's too politically sensitive, or they say, we don't know everything yet. Some things will later be declassified, and only then will we really know the true story. But actually, I think it's worth doing contemporary history very soon after key events, because you capture the voice of the people, the participants, while they still remember things very, very keenly. So for me, it was most important to sit with the men and women who fought this war, and this battle in particular in Aden, and sit with them for hours and hours and hours, eating, drinking, living with them when they were on operations in Yemen, sitting there at night with maps on the floor and helping them to remember what had happened to them. And it's not just important for history, it's also important for mental health, because in the West, we have been through so many years of war now that we've learned it's quite important for people who have been in a war to talk about their experiences. And in this culture, people are not so used to that at the moment. There's secrecy, but there's also just the way Emirati men and women are, and the way they discuss official business. It's actually very important for them to talk to each other and to gather as groups sometimes and relive what they've been through. But that really helps people to overcome the feelings, or at least come to terms with them, after they've been involved in these life-changing, very dramatic events.
I think part of that is also a sense of, very high sense of duty and responsibility, where it's almost, it would be unbecoming to see a personal sacrifice or a personal experience as being important, because you see it as part of a wider responsibility, which I think even in places like the UK and the US until recently was really that sense that, military, officers, officials, so forth, have a duty to do, and so their own personal experience isn't as important, which of course it is. And that's one of the strengths of this book, because we get the wider vision, the kind of strategy, the UAE military strategy, but then we also get characters and individuals that we get to know. And one of your characters is Dr. Aisha. And it's really important because I think often globally in military histories, you don't have a female voice or protagonist. So tell us a bit about why you decided to include her amongst those who are telling the stories.
Well, a big effort was made in this book to do justice to everyone for the role that they played in the Battle of Aden. A huge effort was put into ensuring that I interviewed everyone that I needed to interview, with no exceptions. And the reason for that is because until you speak to everyone and hear all of their different views of the same situation, you can't really add up what is happening in this very complicated business of war. Now, Dr. Aisha is a very interesting officer, first of all, and lady as well, who was leading the medical engagement in the Battle of Aden. In other words, her job was to make sure that Aden's hospitals were ready to cope with a surge of casualties that might come from the final battle to liberate Aden from the Houthis. And so she took the extremely brave decision to deploy into Aden, where there was only a small pocket, a defensive pocket at that time, with their backs to the wall, to the sea rather. And they were being resupplied by boat and sometimes even by parachute resupply. And the Houthis were all around. But Dr. Aisha realized to assess what the hospitals in Aden needed, she had to go and visit those hospitals in the heart of the battle zone. And that meant she had to get on the ground and she had to move with very limited protection to stay low profile amongst all the hospitals in Aden city and look at what was in their medical cabinets, speak to the doctors, find out where they needed to hire new surgeons. And so that's what she did. And it's a fascinating story of a very accomplished female officer who had already done multiple tours in Afghanistan and had seen many other very dangerous situations, who volunteered to come into this environment and to build surgical teams in Aden, not only so that UAE armed forces and Yemeni armed forces would be better supported, but also so that they could reduce the number of unnecessary amputations of civilians' limbs that were happening at the start of the battle, because there were not effective surgical units set up at the Aden hospitals.
I want to ask you about the writing process. So give us an idea of how long it took you to write, but also, how you came to put it all together, so to speak, because as you said, you had many, many days, weeks, months of interviews and sitting with different people, some you knew from before and some you got introduced to do. Tell us more about your writing process.
So everyone has a unique writing process. I would characterize mine as a writing process that really accelerates and intensifies towards the end of the process. And by that I mean, in the first half of the process, the first half of the time I spend writing a book, I generate maybe 25% of the value. And by the end, the last weeks or months of writing the book, I'm generating a lot of the value. In some ways, maybe 40%, 50%, because you get these eureka moments when suddenly you understand something that you didn't realize, but also nobody in the world realized, and that's the joy of writing. So for me, what I find is my questions get better and more important and more focused the closer we get to the end of the project, which means, and this is infuriating for all the people who assist the project, you have to keep interviewing right up to the end to fill the gaps. Now, I pre-write very heavily, meaning I research tremendously deeply. And even though I could get away with interviewing one person about this event that happened, I interview 4 or 5. Because even though a lot of it will be duplicative, the extra little percentages of value that you're getting from those, and also the way that you're multi-sourcing the information, is really important. So I go over the top in terms of research, and I prepare the structure of the book in tremendous detail, down to the individual paragraphs. And so it's like setting up a line of dominoes. All the work is in the setting up. And then when it comes time to write, you're just knocking one over, and then suddenly I get the joy of writing, and the whole book comes out often in weeks, really. But the amount of work that's gone into getting to that moment of knocking over the domino is critical, and that's where no book is sole authored in reality. In reality, they're always a team effort. So for me, the superb assistance I got from Ministry of Defence right the way through this entire process was tremendous. And it was a very light touch, and I really commend them for that, because, this was a first for them, and they managed to protect security and to protect the identities of the participants, but to tell the story in great depth and in a way that just makes it impossible to criticize as a history, because it's so complete and so detailed. And so I think, Ministry of Defence and Ministry of Foreign Affairs deserve enormous credit for the way they handled this project, because I think it's very modern, and it really shows how a bit more openness and taking some risks produces a superb product for the future of the United Arab Emirates as a nation. It's produced something unique and that will last forever now, that could easily have been lost to history if we'd waited even a couple more years. But now we have it.
It's great. So I want to give the opportunity to our great attendants here to ask any questions. So please indicate to me if you'd like to ask a question. As I said, we can take questions in Arabic or English as you please. So please let me know. Okay, so there's a lady at the very back there. Is there a mic? I don't know if yes, they've got a mic coming to you.
صفاء النجار الحياة TV. I'd like to know, is this book tells a story, a history, or it's only a point of view, only a side of the story? And how can we emphasize this point, and how we know the truth? Thank you.
So, even a history that is as accurate as it possibly can be is obviously only a part of the story. There will always be people you don't speak to. There will always be other points of view. And when it's in a war, it's a very rare journalist who can embed with both sides, and particularly both sides of a battle. You have to wait for many years after a war to sometimes interview people on both sides of a battle. So you're quite right that there's no Houthi interviewees in this particular book. On the other hand, Yemeni civilians give you a lot to work with when you're trying to understand the enemy side of the war. Also, the Houthis' own statements, and also, I knew the Houthis before this war, back in 2006 to 2010, when I used to work in Yemen. So during those periods, they were at war with the Saleh government, but they were still accessible to some extent, some of the Houthis, at the edges of their movement. So I kind of understood a little bit about where they'd come from and their background, and I'd done a lot of field work and also research work on the enemy, in this case. But I agree with you. To me, anyway, the more accurate you get a history, the more you can trust it. I mean, it sounds obvious, but your intentions need to be very good to begin with. They need to be like as if you are recording something for history. And you can't edit that history. You might soften the odd thing because it's so painful, but you can't exclude things. And I was very proud of the way the UAE handled this story, because, there are good moments in it, there are bad moments, there are sad moments, there are scary moments. It's like a military history, it's like a military operation. There are moments when you think you're going to lose. And what I found really interesting with this project was helping the Emirati government to sort of become more comfortable with saying, this moment was very difficult. You know, at this moment, we almost quit. Because sometimes here, the temptation is people feel like they have to be perfect. And what's great about this book is it shows Emirati soldiers, sailors, airmen, you know, men and women, as they really are, which is brave, competent, capable, successful, but also human. And that's really important to understand that your service people out there in harm's way are still people, and they'll be people when they come home afterwards.
Thank you. There's a lady here in the front row. We'll just get you a mic.
Hello, thank you so much. Thank you. I would like really to thank you for this important analysis and especially for your experience in Aden. My question, it will be about your experience. Based on your experience in Arabic word, in the field of the security and defense approach, what is your message for future generation, especially in Aden and globally? Thank you so much.
Well, you don't get anything for free in this world. And the people of Aden learned that they needed to protect themselves. One of the most profound things in the book 25 Days to Aden, and I'll just say that the best lines in the book all come from the soldiers and the Yemeni civilians who are there. They, when it comes out sometimes, it's just the heart of a conflict coming out and being expressed. They get to the heart of it with some of the things they say. So there's a quote in the foreword to 25 Days to Aden where a young Emirati soldier is talking about how when he went to Yemen, you know, he was lonely, he missed his family, he was living in these terrible conditions, and how it made him appreciate what he had at home, the nation, the stability, the security, the unity, and how important those things were. So sometimes only by going out and seeing how the rest of the world lives can you really appreciate what you have at home and how important it is to protect it. And the people of Aden, you know, they also learned that no army was going to come and do the job for them. They had to mobilize to protect their very streets, their homes, against an enemy that was far more powerful. And they rose to that challenge. Even though the people of Aden are not warlike people, you know, you hear about Yemen and you think, oh, tribes, weapons. But, you know, the people of Aden, the people of McCullough, they're peaceful people. They're traders, they're sailors, they're fishermen. And they realized they had to fight, and they did that. They defended their place, and they did it successfully with the help of the UAE. So I think that's the key thing. Value what you have at home and protect it.
Language. Do you have any experience to learn Arabic language? Especially now, we're talking about the society, Arabic society. So do you have any experience? And I have another small question. Please, it's about the institute, Washington Institute. Do you have any experience to learn Arabic language? Especially you have a mentions in Arabic words, like not only in Aden, but in other countries. So thank you.
Thank you.
So my greatest regret in life is that I never became Arabic fluent. If I could change one thing, that's what I would change. And that's what I encourage any young analyst or writer to do, is become fluent in as many languages as you can, as young as you can. I'm afraid I come from Britain, and that means that I was never really trained in the mechanics of any language, including the British language. It may surprise some of you, but the British do not teach their own children how to speak English properly. And they don't teach us grammar in the way that Arabic is taught grammar. So we don't really have the building blocks of language. And as a result of many things being in English, cinema, books, etc., television, we have no incentive. So we miss the point of our education where it's easy for us to learn. And we tend to get into older life when it's hard for us to learn. So I tried to learn Arabic, but one thing I found, and this is frustrating, is that whichever part of the Arabic world I would go to next, nobody would understand what I was saying. You have too many accents for me, I'm afraid, too many dialects. So I was discouraged at the wrong point, and then my work became so technical, my language could never catch up with it. So I'm sorry to say, maybe one day, inshallah.
Inshallah. Inshallah. There's a gentleman here with a question.
Hi, thank you very much. I think it was Winston Churchill who said history is written by the vectors. And if I like to think about it like a devil's advocate. What about the Houthis in this case? Do you think they would look at you as someone who's supporting the vectors and you did not show their point of view and why they wanted to do this, regardless of we agree with them or not?
Well, I know what the Houthis think of me, and it's not, they're not very friendly. On the other hand, they were not very friendly to me before I wrote this book. So, you know, I've had a lot of experience. Most of my work deals with Iran-backed militias in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. So I've been in a conflict-type relationship with most of these militias for a long time. Honestly, I wasn't like that to begin with. I'll tell you a little secret. The first people to ever shoot at me was the Israelis when I was a journalist in southern Lebanon with Nick Blanford, who's with the Daily Star at that point, probably still is. And, you know, they were the first ones to ever really act. And back then, I thought Hezbollah seemed fine. I was like a lot of Europeans. Now, once I went to Iraq for a couple of years and saw the evidence of Iranian influence with the Iraqi militias who were actively trying to kill me, it sort of changed my view of things. Again, with the Houthis, when I started, I was quite sorry for them in 2006 to 2010. I wanted to understand their side of the thing, which I did at the time. But again, as time went on, things I saw in Yemen after 2015 and things that I learned about the Houthi movement and their very tight connection with the Revolutionary Guard changed my opinion of them. Just even on the battlefield, I saw the Houthis doing things in Yemen that I still can't understand. The booby trapping of children's toys in order to kill Yemeni civilian children. I just don't understand why they would do it. It had no military value. The only thing I can think of is that the Houthis are still very angry at all the other elements in Yemen for not coming to their aid when they were being bombarded by the Saleh government back in 2004 through to 2010. And in many ways, they still take revenge on everyone, whether they're innocent or guilty. And so, you know, I saw many things with the Houthis that made me reconsider them. And I also think they've changed. I don't think they're the same movement they were in 2003 or in 2006 or 2010. I think they've become something much, much closer to Lebanese Hezbollah, an exact copy. And so, you know, I try to get inside the Houthi head and I try and see things from their perspective. But overall, I think of them as an enemy and a danger.
Can I just, I'll come back to you. But I just want to pick up on again, when military histories are written, it's quite often, you know, focusing on a particular military force. You're not writing the history of the war or the history, you know, of Aden getting all sides, but it's really a military history to understand the military themselves. And of course, the battlefield is important, but you're also trying to understand and you're describing to the reader the strategy, the way that this military operates, their ethos, the doctrine, correct? So you don't necessarily, it's not the sort of book where you have to speak to all sides to get a so-called balanced or objective view of the battle itself.
Well, first of all, you know, objectivity to the truth is one thing, and I think I have that. Objectivity to the two sides, I don't have that. I believe the UAE and the Yemeni Republic of Yemen government was correct to try and stop the Houthis from overrunning Aden and taking over the country in 2015. But I am objective to the truth. And as a result, for instance, when writing the book, sometimes people would say to me, you seem like you're giving the Houthis a lot of, you're sort of admiring them. And in some cases, you know, there's something admirable about the enemy. And again, teaching people here how to talk about the enemy without hatred, with a fair appreciation for their strengths and their weaknesses is kind of important, because it's hard for people here to be impartial about the enemy or impartial about friends. So
I wouldn't just say that's here.
no,
I have to say, I've worked in the US enough to know that the enemy is not always treated in the same way. But I think from a military perspective, you're saying.
well, I mean, I would disagree a little bit in that often when you get with US military and they'll be talking about Iraqi insurgents or Al-Qaeda or whatever, they'll sort of say, I have to give it to those guys, you know, they were tough. And the real fighting men and women in the UAE are like that as well. They say, yeah, the enemy was very brave. I saw this happen, I saw that happen. You know, evil but brave, you know, and that's not always the case with people who haven't been to the war. They want to see the enemy as just bad. And so, you know, it's great to be able to bring those kind of perspectives into a story that's now out there in beautifully translated Arabic that's, I hope, and I'm reliably informed, has really captured the way it was written originally. And again, that's down to the really loving care and attention that was put into preserving my voice, the author's voice, within a book, within a translated book. And I can't thank everybody enough for doing that.
I want to follow up, we'll come back, but I want to follow up on a point that you also spoke about, which is, you know, the war itself. Some people portray the war almost like it's a war of choice, that the UAE chose to go into it, whereas those who know the developments as they were happening from 2014 to 2015 say actually this was a war of necessity and what it would have meant for the Gulf. How would you describe it? Was this a war of choice or was it a war of necessity?
So, you know, when the Soviets put nuclear weapons into Cuba, right next to America, the US nearly destroyed the world in 1962, right? In the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's how it reacted to a threat right next door. You know, if the Soviets had taken over Mexico, or threatened to, the US would not have stood there and done nothing. Similarly, you know, when I think of the coalition's war in Yemen from 2015 onwards, the parallel I think of is the Korean War back in the 1950s. The United Nations saw that the north of the country was going to try and overrun the south with the assistance of a foreign power, China, and so the United Nations acted to prevent that overrun, and they ended up creating a dividing line halfway up the country. No one would say the United Nations was wrong to do that. No one would say the United Nations lost that war. But one thing that's important to remember is that in Korea, after we prevented the North and China from overrunning the country, we then helped to build that South Korea up into a strong, prosperous, secure state. And that's really what we need to do with the non-Houthi controlled Yemen. Otherwise, if you can imagine after the Korean War, if the US and everyone else had simply left South Korea and not supported it, the North would have reinvaded with China, and there would be no South Korea now. There would only be a much bigger North Korea, which would not be good for anyone. So that's why I think the key thing we've got to focus on now is finishing the job. And that means creating a free Yemen that can defend itself for the foreseeable future and has economic prosperity that's greater than the North that the Houthis are controlling.
Okay, so the gentleman wanted to come up with a follow-up question, and then we'll come here. But please, briefly.
Thank you very much. If you compare what the Houthis did and as people, and you compare it to what you've seen in the region, do you think there is any kind of a difference, or is it some kind of a common thought that is among the Arabs and the Muslims in the region where they feel that anger towards what's happened?
Okay, so without getting too deep, you know, Yemenis are very sensitive to foreign intervention, open foreign intervention, whether it's meant to hurt or help. They're quite sensitive to that. So it's very easy to portray any foreign involvement in the country in a negative light. That's always been the case. That's one of the challenges of trying to help or intervene there or whatever. The Houthis have grievances as individuals. My problem with them is that a foreign agenda has been injected at the top level, which is to say Abdul Malik al-Houthi, his father, and some of his closest family members were cultivated by the Revolutionary Guard and Lebanese Hezbollah to take over northern Yemen one day. And that's very clear and easy to prove, and indeed there's a very detailed West Point Combating Terrorism Center article by myself and a bunch of co-authors from Yemen and the US that really detail how that happened between the 80s and 2011 Arab Spring kind of time. So, you know, I see both sides, but there's a foreign agenda now. It's a big part of that. It's not that the Iranians control everything they do. It's that they've created a little clone that wants to do those things anyway. So it's a partner. And it's a very dangerous partner. In theory, in my view, the Houthis could become more important than Lebanese Hezbollah quite easily and more capable. And they're right there on the Arabian Peninsula and on the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea.
It's gentleman here.
I would like to initially thank you for this extraordinary piece of art. Nonetheless, based on your expertise in the region and in Yemen in particular, and based on the current circumstances, what do you think about the idea of restructuring Yemen into a two-state confederacy in which you'd have two nation states under one political umbrella, sort of like the EU, but with more autonomy and sovereignty to the nation states in the south and the north? Would that enhance the prospects of reaching positive peace?
Well, so I'm gonna change history by being the first white man to not draw lines on a map, okay? And I'm gonna say, let's leave this to the Yemenis, obviously. But I will say one thing. Unless something changes, it's gonna be a 2 or 3 country solution. That's where we are now. So something has got to change, or we will remain on the lines we're on now for the foreseeable future. And because we've been on those lines before, with the old People's Democratic Republic of Yemen and Northern Yemen Republic, it can hold in that way. So, you know, someone has to produce a formula that has never really worked before to unite this place. I'm not going to say reunite, because in some ways it's never really been properly united consensually in a sustainable way. And I don't know whether that should be what we want. I've spent a lot of time in Iraq, where the Kurds want to have their own state. In my view, they have a right to self-determination, and then nobody should force them to stay within a state. And I guess that's how I feel about most places. Unless people see benefit in being in it, like here, you guys have made it work. You know, you've become tight with mutual benefit, with mutual respect. Unless that happens in other places, people will want to be on their own and do their own thing.
So I want to ask you about modern warfare. Of course, there is a war in Ukraine that, you know, and war in Europe kind of changed people's perspective, because it seemed to be, when you look from a European or American perspective, war is something that happens somewhere far away. But also modern warfare has changed, and a lot from Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, has developed when you think about counterinsurgency, asymmetrical warfare, and so forth. In writing this book, and I want to bring it back to the book, there's detail about the type of warfare that happens, while of course maintaining the important classified information. How has modern warfare changed, and how do you see it changing, especially with the introduction now of drones, of AI, and so forth?
Well, what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is an extraordinary debut for artificial intelligence in warfare in a way that you can really measure and see. And what that is that we are in real time taking everyone's iPhone in Ukraine, soldiers, civilians, and we're linking it to an AI system, and whenever anyone sends anything in, a picture of an artillery shell, an enemy soldier, an enemy tank, a broken bridge, the AI is deciding where that information needs to go, and it's getting it to everyone else's iPhones in almost real time. And it's also connecting to all of the satellites going overhead, which have almost all been put in Ukraine's service, to say, let's take a look at that thing right now and check it's actually still there and it's real. And it can recognize it, and therefore it can pass on that information to whoever needs it. So, you know, in some ways we're seeing the next kind of war happening in Ukraine. And it's one in which Western states have a pretty significant advantage at the moment. But everyone else is going to learn this style too. And I must say, I feel really sorry for future generations of soldiers, because the environment is going to get so much more lethal. If you mass, if you present a good target, there's a very significant chance of you getting killed. Now, interestingly, the Houthis were one of the first groups of people to experience this, which is why they developed a unique fighting style in which they operated usually in groups of no bigger than 3 people. A Houthi combat unit has 1 cameraman for propaganda, 2 fighters, and they can all fit on 1 trail bike. And they never move in numbers larger than that. And they hardly ever move carrying a weapon. They leave the weapons in the various places they fight from, and they move around unarmed so they look like civilians. And they don't use cell phones, and they don't give off any electronic signals. So these guys learn very early how to operate in an environment of total enemy intelligence and air supremacy. And that's increasingly probably what future infantrymen are going to be fighting like on Western battlefields as well. One fun thing about this book is that in some ways it's almost like the last battle of the old world, because in this battle, it was the last time the Houthis failed to have a drone in the air. After this battle, they always had drones. And what this meant was that the UAE could do something very old-fashioned. It could bring its forces into Aden at night through a really interesting and exciting clandestine naval operation, silently bringing in its forces every night, building them up without the Houthis detecting them. And the only reason it could do that was because it could hide them behind the volcanic peaks in Aden. If the Houthis had had even 1 drone, they would have been able to see those groups building up. And ever since that battle, we've had to cope with the fact that we can hide almost nothing from the enemy. And that creates a really dangerous environment for soldiers, sailors, airmen.
There's a question here. No? Yeah.
Well, thank you for your fruitful discussion, Mina Arabi and Dr. Knight. Actually, this is a personal question for you, Dr. Knight, more towards your experience as a historical writer. You mentioned the importance of recording contemporary history, and I emphasize the importance of that as well. Being from a region that is no stranger to violent eruptions, insurgency, protests, and military war. I'm from Iraq, and it's very common for us to see protests and violent eruptions. And as you mentioned, recording these historical events that pave the way for like a new form of state building is key to our culture. So my question for you is, independent writers, researchers, activists that seek to immortalize their history, that seek to kind of write the history of their country through their lens, and have no support or backing or institutions that support them, and instead are actually like attacked for their right of word or their expression. What is your advice to them? How can we write our history and kind of own it, despite these challenges that we face as journalists, writers, researchers, activists you know, even potentially writing a tweet, recording an event that happened potentially about a protest or about a military movement. I think you can draw parallels between Yemen and Iraq, particularly because of your experience in both. So what would your advice be to young, even older independent journalists and writers on this topic?
Thank you.
That's a super difficult question, because if there was an easy answer, you wouldn't be asking me. So, first of all, it's not, no one who's young wants to hear the words "be patient," because everything is urgent and everything is now, and it feels urgent, and it is urgent. You know, when you feel that there's something that's not right about the world and you want to show that. However, patience and finding the right moment and finding the right way to bring your truth out is the best way. It might require waiting. It might require putting it into fiction format, which is something that a number of people have done in order to tackle the most difficult truths in their society, is that they will put it into a fiction format. That's been the case, for instance, in Iraq, where saying the wrong thing could get you killed by militias, and so people have put political novels into, you know, political analyses into a novel kind of setting. Everyone knows what you're talking about, but it does, you know, I've really learned over the years in the Middle East, there's a difference between saying something and naming someone. Once you name someone, you've really thrown down a challenge, and you have to be very, very careful with that. But you can allude to many things, and you can get your message across. So I suppose being subtle, being patient, being persistent, and just getting on with it and writing. No, the internet is a big place, and anything can live out there forever. And it's a great way to get noticed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those insights. I'm afraid we have run out of time, so I would just urge you to get 25 يوما إلى عدن, 25 days to Aden. We're delighted that Michael will be signing copies of the book, so please stay behind and he will... Yes, please.
Well, just one more thing. My biggest hope for the book is that young Emiratis will read it and will themselves want to go and write military histories. You know, my job here is to put myself out of a job, right? So I basically want to put some examples out there that young Emiratis, including servicemen and women, can think about writing themselves one day, and therefore, you know, your military histories will be written by yourselves, you who understand it the best of all.
Thank you. Well, with that, the challenge of getting the right military histories, thank you so much for your time.